United States History by Joseph Jarrell. Chapter 14, The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Dogwood blossoms and yellow jasmine danced in the warm spring breeze. Across the country, men gathered on village greens, their knapsacks laden with goodies, their cheeks with kisses, their heads with laurels. Most had seen little or none of the world beyond their horizons, and now they were eager to go teach the Yankees or the Northerners, or the rebels and the Southerners, depending upon where their horizon happened to lie, a thing or two. Shiny brass, scarlet sashes, golden trim, and glistening rifles all drew the admiration of wives, sweethearts, and the envy of little boys with stick guns marching through the milling crowd. The spring of 1861, with its pageantry and patriotism, gave little hint of the reality ahead. 4 years later, those village scenes were drained of the color and clamor of the first spring. Veterans, pale and disfigured, hobbled past their old parade ground. Black draped windows moved about the square, and little boys, so anxious to trade their sticks for swords, never reached the battlefront. Many of their fathers never returned home. In the fight, both sides demonstrated remarkable courage. The Southern soldiers heroically fought in the face of overwhelming odds, and the Northern soldier pursued victory in the face of devastating casualties. The war produced more than courage, however. The bitterness of a war in which countrymen killed each other had far-reaching consequences. The war had swept the land forever, changed the face of its people and its politics. Issues that should have been handled with ballots were settled with bullets. As one historian has starkly observed, when the war was over, slavery was dead, secession was dead, and 600,000 men were dead. Number 1, War of Brothers. Causes. A number of complex competing forces converged and clashed to produce the bloodiest chapter in American history: Union versus secession. The central issue that sparked the Civil War concerned the nature of the Union. Could states that voluntarily joined the Union by ratifying the Constitution voluntarily leave the Union? The issue had been hotly debated since the earliest years of the Republic. During the War of 1812, opposition to the war created strong secessionist sentiment among some disgruntled Federalists in New England. After 1830, the growing sense of frustration over the South's minority role in Congress simply renewed what was, in fact, an open constitutional question at the time: do the states have the right to secede? The fact that the secession question was a central cause of the war was underscored by Congress. The war resolution, approved 121 to 2 in the House of Representatives on July 25, 1861, stated plainly that in this national emergency, this war is not waged in any spirit of oppression, or for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, or of overthrowing or interfering with the right or establishing institutions of those states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution, to preserve the Union with all the dignity, equality, and rights, and that as soon as these objects are accomplished, the war ought to cease. Many Southern leaders asserted the constitutional right of secession based on state sovereignty. According to the states' rights view, each state was largely an independent entity joined in a voluntary compact of union, but a union in which they maintained their identity and were not subordinate to a centralized national authority. Many Northern leaders insisted that secession was unconstitutional. They believed that when states ratified the Constitution, they were surrendering state sovereignty. They believed that Article 6 of that document made this clear. Thus the war opened with the constitutional question and countercharges over which statesmen had wrestled for decades. The North argued that the Union must be preserved above all else. The South argued that the rights and liberties of the states must be preserved, even at the expenses of the Union. Now the issue would be settled in battle. Economics. Economic differences between the North and the South also played a vital role in bringing about the war. The foundation of the Northern economy was industry and manufacturing, whereas the foundation of the Southern economy was agriculture, especially cotton production. Sugar, rice, tobacco, hemp, and other crops were also major ingredients of the Southern economy. The South produced these raw materials and shipped them both to the Northern factories and to foreign countries. Tied to much of the agricultural economy was the practice of slavery. One of the often overlooked contributing factors to the war was the tariff. The North favored a high tariff, not as a source of revenue, though it was a good revenue source for the government, but as a means of protecting its industries from foreign imports. The South opposed a high tariff because it had little industry. Foreign imports and trade supported its economy. A high tariff hurt trade and made foreign products more expensive. Southerners believed that they were, in effect, being forced to pay the tariff to support Northern industry. Slavery. Slavery was an integral part of the Southern culture. A major reason Southern states seceded was that many leaders there did not believe Lincoln's assurances that he would not interfere in their way of life, which depended on slavery. The Southern farming economy relied heavily on slave labor. Thus, slavery played an important role in the decisions that led to war. In the North, abolitionists had made gradual gains in public opinion, at least in opposition to the expansion of slavery. Of course, racial prejudice in the North and fear that freeing slaves would cause many slaves to move to the North and compete for the jobs there made many Northerners indifferent to the plight of blacks in bondage. Nonetheless, the moral problem was difficult to ignore. There was an obvious contradiction between the proposition that all men were created equal and the institution of slavery. Only about 1/4 of Southern families owned slaves. However, by the time of the Civil War, many Southerners, even those who did not own slaves, argued that slavery was good. Some even insisted that Southern slave culture cultivated the virtues of honor, courage, duty, and dignity. George McDuffie, governor of South Carolina in the 1840s, called slavery the cornerstone of our Republican edifice government system. As a result, Northern opposition to slavery was seen as interference with the core of Southern society. Concerns. Not everyone understood the emotionally charged issues of secession, union, states' rights, economics, and slavery. Often people tend to characterize each section as having uniform sympathies and motives. Not so. For example, some pro-slavery men fought for the Union, and some who cared little about defending slavery fought for the Confederacy. Many soldiers were indifferent to or even ignorant of the motives with which they were often charged for fighting against their countrymen. They answered the call to arms out of a sense of duty, whether as Southern patriots or Northern patriots. Perhaps Robert E. Lee best illustrates the dilemma that many Southerners faced at the outset of the war. Lee had a great American heritage as the son of a Revolutionary War hero, Henry "Light Horse Harry" Lee, and his wife was the step-granddaughter of George Washington. Lee had already given 30 years of distinguished service to his country as an officer in the Army. In April of 1861, Lincoln offered him a job as commander of the Union Army. Earlier, Lee had told a friend, "If Virginia stands by the old Union, so will I. But if she secedes, though I do not believe in secession as the constitutional right, nor that there is sufficient cause for revolution, then I will follow my native state with my sword, and, if need be, with my life." When Virginia left the Union, he declined Lincoln's offer and resigned, declaring, "Save in defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." Some have argued that the war resulted from a leadership failure that permitted extremists to take the terms of debate to their own ends. Historian James Randall summarizes the issue thus: "Let one take all the factors traditionally presented, the Sumter maneuver, the election of Lincoln, abolitionism, slavery in Kansas, pre-war objections to the Union, cultural and economic differences, etc., and it will be seen that only by a kind of false display could any of these issues, or all of them together, be said to have caused the war if one omits the elements of emotional unreason and over-bold leadership. If one word or phrase were selected to account for the war, that word would not be slavery, or economic grievance, or state rights, or diverse civilization. It would have to be such a word as fanaticism, on both sides. misunderstanding, misrepresentation, or perhaps politics. Comparison. Behind the massing armies of the North and the South were a number of sectional differences that would prove to be critical factors over the course of the war. Resources. In terms of the basic resources of population, food production, and industrial output, the North had the advantage in every area. The 18 northern states had a population of 22 million, more than twice that of the 11 seceding states. The Confederate States of America, and 9 million people, of which 3.5 million were slaves. Napoleon once remarked that an army marches on its stomach. In this regard, the army marched much farther. The agriculture of the South, in terms of volume, was geared toward the cash crops of cotton and tobacco, which would do little to sustain hungry troops. The North's Midwest region dominated production of wheat, corn, and oats. The two regions, however, were more balanced in their numbers of livestock. Sharp differences existed between the sections over manufacturing ability. The North had 5 times the number of factories and 10 times the number of industrial workers. The North also had twice the railroad mileage of the South and the capacity to produce more. In retrospect, it is difficult to see how the South fought on for 4 years in the face of such odds. Leaders. One area in which the South surpassed the North, particularly in the early years of the war, was its military leadership. The South had a strong military tradition, and many Southerners attended West Point, the National Military Academy, and military academies in the South. As a result, many of the Confederate officers were better trained than their Union counterparts at the onset of the war. This command difference was particularly pronounced in the Eastern campaigns, where Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jeb Stuart displayed brilliance and resourcefulness that often bewildered their opponents. Other leaders, despite being untrained, proved their worth militarily, especially in the West. Nathan Bedford Forrest, for example, proved to be one of the South's greatest cavalry leaders, and John Hunt Morgan and John Mosby became legendary in the feats of unconventional warfare. The North had its own share of military heroes, but when the war began, the South had an advantage in military leadership. Strategy. The two sides also differed in their strategy for winning the war. The North would have to invade the South and defeat the Southern armies on the battlefield. General Winfield Scott, commander of the Union Army at the beginning of the war, devised a plan. First, he proposed a blockade of Southern ports to make it difficult for the Confederacy to obtain necessary supplies. Second, Scott's plan called for the control of the Mississippi River. This would split the Confederacy and hamper its ability to move men and supplies from west to east and to trade the world through New Orleans. Unlike his more enthusiastic subordinates, Scott, himself a Virginian, believed a quick military victory over the South was unlikely. Rather, his plan involved slowly eliminating the Confederacy's ability to wage war. The Northern press, reflecting the popular view that the war would last only a few weeks, mockingly called Scott's theme the Anaconda Plan, after a large South American snake that slowly crushes its prey within its coils. Scott's ideas, though, would eventually prove both realistic and successful. Later, the strategy was modified to include 2 additional goals: to believe and conquer the South heartland, and to capture the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. The Confederate strategy was largely defensive, to outlast the enemy's will to fight. In general, the Southern soldiers took up arms for the compelling reason that he was fighting to protect home and family and an invading force, which over the long term proved a sustaining motivation in the face of death and hardship. Defending the home front strengthened the will to fight, but the strategy risked Southern devastation by attacking forces. Number 2. War in the East. The contest in the East, fought largely in Virginia, centered on the North's attempt to defeat the Confederate Army and capture the new capital at Richmond, Virginia. The Confederate government's move from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond linked the success of the Confederacy to the fortunes of the state that would contribute the most to the cause. "On the Richmond" was the battle cry and characterized much of the Union strategy. However, Richmond had capable and courageous defenders who would force the Union Army into a long, costly campaign. In the spring of 1861, both North and South, most people believed that a quick, divisive battle held somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Richmond would end the war. Lincoln's initial call for troops in April was for an enlistment of 3 months. These summer soldiers, like their Southern counterparts, were eager for fame and fighting. They would soon get a chance to prove themselves at a little Virginia crossroads called Manassas Junction. First Battle of Bull Run, July 1861. With the Northern press clamoring for something to write about, and the 3-month enlistments nearing an end of about 80,000 troops, Lincoln felt pressure to take the offensive. General Irvin McDowell, field commander of the Union forces, was ordered south to take Richmond. On July 18th, McDowell's troops encountered the Confederate forces under General Beauregard near Manassas Junction, a railroad intersection about 25 miles southwest of Washington. In Washington, news of the massing armies was the talk of the town. Hundreds of spectators, from senators to socialites, turned out in their finery with picnic baskets in hand for the gala event. This curious crowd included Illinois Congressman John Logan. After arriving for the front-line festivities, he decided to join the troops. He went into battle wearing a top hat and a tuxedo. The Confederates chose to take a stand at a little stream near Manassas called Bull Run. On Sunday morning, July 21st, McDowell launched his attack. At first, the raw Federal Union troops did well, pushing back the equally raw Confederates. However, the timely arrival of troops under South Carolinian Bernard B. and the Virginian Thomas J. Jackson stemmed the tide, facing heavy fire and repeated assaults. B's troops were about to retreat, but B, galloping among his troops and urging them to hold the line, reportedly pointed to Jackson's brigade and shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." The name stuck. Jackson was therefore known as Stonewall Jackson. As for B, his inspiring words were among his last. Riding at the front of his troops under murderous fire, he was struck down, an early casualty in the long list of war dead. The Confederate line held, and by mid-afternoon McDowell's troops had been pushed back. The retreat turned into a complete disaster as unseasoned Union troops and panicky picnickers scrambled toward Washington. The victorious Confederates, however, were too exhausted and too disorganized to follow up their win. They celebrated rather than pursued the Union army. After the Confederate victory at the first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, the South was relieved and confident, the North demoralized. The next day, Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George B. McClellan. The most significant result was that both sides were beginning to realize that the war would not be over quickly. Members of Congress, some of whom had attended the Sunday afternoon picnic near Bull Run, voted for 500,000 more troops for a 3-year enlistment. The season for summer soldiers had passed. Peninsular Campaign from March to July of 1862. In the months following Bull Run, McClellan took the shattered remnants of McDowell's army and the flood of raw recruits and organized and drilled them into an impressive force called the Army of the Potomac. That, however, was about all McClellan did with his army, organize and drill them. Lincoln, eager for aggressive action, commented, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a time." By the spring of 1862, Lincoln ordered McClellan south to Richmond. The general offered an alternate plan. He would move his troops up the peninsula between the James and York rivers and attack Richmond from the east, then send a second force from the north and crush the capital with the two armies. The Monitor and the Merrimac, March 1862. McClellan's plans to use the James River as a supply line was nearly upset before the campaign began. The Confederates, unveiling a new weapon, an iron-clad and iron-plated warship, the ugly but dangerous monster was built on the damaged hull of an abandoned Union warship, the USS Merrimac, which Southerners had renamed the CSS Virginia. This vessel, with its heavy iron armor, 10 guns, and iron ram attached to its bow, sailed out against the Union blockade fleet at Hampton Roads. Virginia on March 8th of 1862, the Merrimac resisted two Union cannons easily sank two large Northern wooden warships, and word quickly spread throughout the North about the South's new weapon. But when the Merrimac returned the next day, it faced a strange opponent, described as a cheese box on a raft and a tin can on a shingle. It was the USS Monitor, the Union's own ironclad. It was an unusual craft. Instead of the usual fixed guns on each side of the ship, the Union vessel had only two revolving guns that could fire in any direction. The Monitor battled the Merrimac for more than 4 hours without any serious damage to the other. Although the battle was a draw, the Monitor had saved the Union fleet at Hampton Roads. More important, the clash was the first between iron warships, and it spelled the end of the age of wooden ships. Diversion in the Valley, March to June of 1826. Considering the numerical advantages of the Union force, McClellan's plan to capture Richmond might have worked if not for Stonewall Jackson and one of the most brilliant campaigns of the war. During the Valley Campaign of March 23 to June 9 of 1862, Jackson, with fewer than 20,000 men, ranged up and down Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, defeating two separate armies. Jackson's force effectively pinned down 50,000 Federal troops before slipping out of the valley for Richmond to help stop McClellan. On to Richmond. Beginning in April of 1862, McClellan, with 100,000 troops, pushed up the neck of the land from Chesapeake Bay toward Richmond. The outnumbered Army of Northern Virginia under General Joseph E. Johnston delayed the Union advance, grudgingly giving ground to the overly cautious McClellan. Eventually, however, the Union forces came within sight of Richmond. On the last day of May, Johnston struck McClellan hard at Fair Oaks on the outskirts of Richmond. The first two-day fight left heavy casualties on both sides. Johnston severely wounded, but would be out of action for months. With the enemy at the gates, CSA President Jefferson Davis turned to his military advisor, Robert E. Lee, to command the army. Lee seized the initiative, launching what would be known as the Seven-Day Battle. From June 25th to July 1st, at obscure little creeks and crossroads such as Gaines Mill, Savage Station, White Oak Swamp, Malvern Hill, the Confederates pushed McClellan's grand army back to the James River, with both sides taking heavy losses. Having been outwitted by Lee, McClellan abandoned the peninsula and returned to Washington, D.C., where he planned to join General John Pope for a new drive on Richmond. Lee, however, had no intention of waiting to be attacked. Second Battle of Bull Run, August 1862. Lee knew that if McClellan's army joined with Pope's army, they would have an overwhelming advantage in manpower and firepower. Lee sent his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, to raid Pope from the rear. Stuart attacked Pope's headquarters, and while the general was away, took the Federal payroll and battle plans, and for good measure, Pope's dress coat. While Stuart was creating havoc at Pope's back door, Lee sent General Jackson around Pope's army. Stonewall's men marched 62 miles in 48 hours, capturing Federal supplies at Manassas Junction and attacking Pope's line on the evening of August 28th. Just as Pope was preparing to attack Jackson the next day, the remainder of Lee's army arrived. On the second day of the battle, Southern defenders cut down brave Federal assaults with devastating effect. With a piercing rebel yell, the Confederates counterattacked, seeming to one retreating Federal like demons emerging from the earth. This second Battle of Bull Run sent Pope's army reeling back to Washington. Remarkably, after only 2 months, Lee had cleared practically all of Virginia of Federal forces. Antietam, September 1862. After his victory at Bull Run, Lee decided to take the war into enemy territory. In September, he crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, hoping to disrupt transportation and communication systems to Washington. He hoped that success on Northern soil would help him gain foreign assistance from the Confederacy or the Union government into ending the war. On September 13th, a Union private found 3 cigars wrapped in papers. These were Lee's orders to one of his generals, ordering that revealed Lee's battle plan. When McClellan was showed the orders, he was overcome with delight. He waved them and boasted, "Here is a paper with which I cannot whip Bobby (Robert E. Lee). I will be willing to go home." Within a day, Lee learned that McClellan had his battle plan and knew his position. Lee quickly gathered his army, a force of about 30,000, and set up a defensive line at Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, where they awaited the onslaught of McClellan's 87,000 troops. At dawn on September 17th, Union forces attacked the Confederate line. At one place between the two armies stood a 40-acre cornfield, ripe and full, ready for the harvest. There was, in fact, a grim harvest that day, as the cornfield became a killing field. The day was a furious swirl of blood, sweat, and smoke as the armies held each other in a death grip. One Confederate recalled, "The sun seemed almost to go backwards, and it appeared as if night would never come." When night finally arrived, 24,000 men had been killed or wounded. It was the bloodiest one-day battle in American history. Lee slipped his battered army back across the Potomac into Virginia. Antietam was technically a Union victory because the Confederates had withdrawn. In reality, however, the battle was a draw. Even so, Lincoln used news of this battle to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. Fredericksburg, December 1862. After Antietam, Lincoln replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. On December 13, 1862, Burnside launched repeated attacks on entrenched Confederate positions on the outskirts of the quaint village of Fredericksburg, Virginia. Before the cold day ended, 12,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. Southern casualties were about half that number. As a dismissal, December closed on 1862, the first full year of war. Burnside, overwhelmed by his losses, broke off the assault. When Lincoln heard of the defeat, he turned command over to yet another general, fighting Joe Hooker. It had been a very bloody year for both sides. Chancellorsville, May 1863. Fighting Joe was popular, proven general. May God have mercy on General Lee. The new commander boasted, "For I will have none." Hooker, with a huge force of 130,000 men, returned to the Fredericksburg area to crush the Southern army. Lee had half the number of troops. Fierce fighting occurred for 5 days in the Battle of Chancellorsville. Hooker was defeated, and the Union general retreated northward with his huge army. Lee's triumph, however, was marred by the fatal wounding of Stonewall Jackson. Tragically for the South, on May 2nd, Confederate troops mistakenly shot Jackson while he rode at the front of his lines at dusk amid the tangled fighting. A surgeon amputated Jackson's left arm, and Stonewall died 8 days later of pneumonia. The loss to Lee and the Southern cause was inestimable. Nonetheless, Lee's decisive win at Chancellorsville pushed back the Union threat, paving the way for more ambitious plans. The Confederacy's victories in the East from first Bull Run to Chancellorsville were important for more than just military glory. First, these victories succeeded in frustrating one of the Union's chief war aims, the capture of Richmond. The only Union victory in the campaign was the bloody stalemate at Antietam. Even then, the battle only drove Lee back into Virginia. It did not bring the Northerners any closer to the Confederate capital. Second, the victories raised the morale of the South and lowered that of the North. Despite defeats in the West, discussed in the next section, Confederates took hope from Lee's triumphs that they might yet win the war. Northerners, on the other hand, became weary of defeat, because all that the South needed to win was for the North to give up. Northern weariness was itself a Southern victory. Third, the longer the South inflicted defeats on the Federals, the more likely it was that a European power such as Britain would recognize the Confederacy and aid its cause. After Chancellorsville, a Southern hope for independence seemed close to fulfillment. Gettysburg, July 1863. Confederate armies in the West had not fared well against Union forces, and growing shortages among Lee's own troops convinced him that the South needed a victory on Northern soil. To help turn the tide, in late June, the Confederate Army marched through Maryland into Pennsylvania. Shielded from view of the Union Army by Jeb Stuart's cavalry, Lee was careful to order his men not to destroy private property or molest citizens. The citizens were surprised to see that the lean soldiers who had so often put the Union Army to flight were poorly clothed and equipped, and that many were barefoot. Neither side chose Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as the site for a major battle. On June 30th, an advance party of Confederates neared the town and clashed with an advance unit of Federals under the command of General George Meade, who had replaced Hooker. The two armies had stumbled on each other. On July 1st, the advancing Confederate army drove the Federals back. The Union Army entrenched on high ground south of Gettysburg. The next day, Lee, who by then had almost his whole army in place, renewed the assault on Meade's position, but Union reinforcements held their line. Pickett's charge. On July 3rd, Lee made one final attempt to dislodge Meade's army by ordering an assault on the center of the Union position along Cemetery Ridge. Fresh troops, mostly veteran Virginians, under the command of General George Pickett, formed a line nearly a mile long, and they marched into the face of a murderous artillery fire. Those who survived Pickett's charge and reached Union lines engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat. Fighting on three sides with no reinforcements, Pickett's men were quickly overwhelmed. About 6,750 men of the 12,500 who made the charge were either killed, wounded, or captured. When Pickett returned numbly to the Confederate lines, Lee ordered him to rally his division for the expected Union counterattack. Pickett reportedly replied, "General, I have no division." The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The two sides had suffered 50,000 casualties between them. It was the single bloodiest engagement of the war. 2 days later, the retreating remnants of Lee's army crossed the Potomac into Virginia, and Meade, exhausted by his costly victory, failed to stop him. The South would never recover from the loss of this battle. Yet the war was far from over. Names of sites on the Gettysburg battlefield still evoke images of the savagery of the conflict. Cemetery Ridge, Round Top, Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheat Field. Gettysburg Address. With the human wreckage of war strewn across the Pennsylvania countryside, 17 acres of the hotly contested ground were set aside to bury the men who had fallen there. 4 months after the battle, the cemetery was dedicated. More than 15,000 spectators, including several governors, were present. The first speaker, noted orator Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln then spoke 10 eloquent sentences. His Gettysburg Address. He noted the common courage and sacrifice of the soldiers. Everett later wrote to Lincoln, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea on that occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Number 3. War in the West. The Civil War in the West differed from the fighting in the East. There were 2 main campaigns in the West, for example, instead of the prolonged single contest between the Army of the Northern Virginia, CSA, and the Army of the Potomac, USA, in the East. In the West, the war from 1861 to 1863 was divided between the Mississippi River Campaign and the Kentucky-Tennessee Campaign. The West also saw a large number of Union victories in contrast to the Confederate triumphs in the East. In addition, while the South's greatest generals, Lee and Jackson, fought in the East, the North's best commanders, U.S. Grant and William Sherman, rose to fame in the West. In one respect, though, the 2 theaters of war were identical. The fighting was hard and bloody. Mississippi River Campaign. One of the most important goals of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan was the capture of the Mississippi River. Union control of the Mississippi would split the Confederacy in 2 and provide Union farmers in the Midwest a needed transportation outlet for their products. Control of the Mississippi was therefore crucial to both sides. The Confederacy sought to maintain its grip through major fortifications on the river, primarily those in Columbus, Kentucky, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and in New Orleans, Louisiana. To win the river, the Union had to break through strongholds. A fleet and a general. One major Union advantage was its river fleet of gunboats. These ugly, ungainly, ironclad warships were nicknamed turtles. for their appearance and slow speed. They were the most powerful force on the western rivers. Another Union advantage in the West was the presence of one of the North's finest generals, Ulysses S. Grant. Forts Henry and Donelson, February 1862. The Union High Command knew that a frontal attack on heavily fortified Columbus, Kentucky, would be foolhardy. Therefore, Grant was ordered to take his troops and the gunboat fleet and capture two important forts behind Columbus in northwest Tennessee, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Grant easily captured the poorly designed Fort Henry on February 6, 1862. Capturing Fort Donelson, 12 miles to the east, was far more difficult. This fort was well designed and garrisoned with some 20,000 Confederate troops. The winter fighting for the fort was hard and bitter, and Grant's men outside the fort suffered terribly. Finally, on February 16th, the Confederate commander sent a message asking for terms of surrender. Grant replied, "No terms except unconditional, immediate surrender can be accepted." The fort fell, and a jubilant Northern public, playing on the general's initials, honored its new hero with the nickname Unconditional Surrender, Grant. With Henry and Donelson in Union hands, the Confederates abandoned Columbus. Then Nashville, Tennessee, fell to the Union, opening the state to Union advances. Shiloh, April 1862. Grant's popularity lasted only until his next battle. As the Union Army moved along the Tennessee River, Confederate Commander General Albert Sidney Johnston decided to strike the enemy a sudden blow. On the morning of April 6, 1862, Johnston's 40,000 soldiers surprised a Union force of about equal size near an abandoned Methodist church called Shiloh. After intense fighting, the disorganized Union forces fell back toward the Tennessee River. As darkness fell, the Union Army was barely holding its position. During the night, however, Northern reinforcements arrived. The Confederates were taking heavy losses, including General Johnston, who had suffered a leg wound and bled to death before he realized how serious the wound was. At dawn on April 7th, Grant counterattacked and drove the Confederates back. The Battle of Shiloh was a Union victory, but it was a costly one. Each side suffered more than 10,000 men killed and wounded. Angry newspapers, politicians called for Grant's dismissal, and Lincoln refused, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." New Orleans, April 1862. April 1862 also brought some good news to the Union. Late in that month, Union Naval Commander David Farragut led the fleet up the Mississippi from the Gulf of Mexico, captured New Orleans, the Southern's largest city, and most important seaport. One major obstacle remained for Union control of the river, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Fall of Vicksburg in July of 1863. Vicksburg was an important river port even before the war. Its high bluffs above the river made it a natural fortress, and the swampy lands near the city made it difficult for an enemy to approach. Jefferson Davis called Vicksburg the nail-head that held the South's two halves together. As long as the Confederates held the city, they could bring supplies and troops from their western regions. Lincoln remarked, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." Vicksburg, therefore, became the focus of the Mississippi campaign. Despite the near disaster at Shiloh, U.S. Grant was the Union's best general, and to him was entrusted the capture of Vicksburg. In the Vicksburg campaign, Grant revealed both a talent for experimentation and a streak of daring. When his first attack on the city in December of 1862 failed, Grant decided to gather his forces north of the city and to try to find a way to bypass the guns of the forts. Throughout the winter in 1862 to 1863, Grant tried first digging a canal and then floating his gunboats and troop transports along the bayous, camps, swamps, streams surrounding the city. All of these attempts failed. Finally, Grant attempted a risky maneuver. First, he marched his men down the swampy western bank of the Mississippi to the point below Vicksburg. Then he floated his fleet on gunboats and transports past the guns on the bluffs under cover of night. This accomplished, Grant ferried his troops across the river below the city. The Union Army had outmaneuvered the Confederates, but it also had abandoned its supply line. The Army had only what its soldiers carried on their backs. Calmly, Grant wrote that he wanted to get up what rations of hard bread, coffee, and salt we can and make the country furnish the rest. Grant's bold strategy worked. His move astonished the Confederates and allowed his army to sweep north and surround Vicksburg by May of 1863. The defenses of the city were too strong to assault, so Grant laid siege to Vicksburg to starve it into submission. Conditions inside the besieged city worsened, and finally on July 4, 1863, the same day that Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. The Mississippi River was completely in Union hands. Abraham Lincoln declared with satisfaction, "The Father of Waters again flows unvexed to the sea." Kentucky-Tennessee Campaign. While Grant was pushing slowly down the Mississippi River, an equally important, but less famous campaign was occurring, the struggle for control of Kentucky and Tennessee. Kentucky. Kentucky was one of the most divided border states. When the war began, for example, the governor was pro-Confederate and the state legislature pro-Union. Faced with the drastic division, the state declared that it would remain neutral. Such neutrality was impossible to maintain considering Kentucky's location. However, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, each eager to win the state to his side, promised to respect Kentucky's wishes. Eventually, the need to protect the Mississippi River forced the Confederates to move into the state. The Union responded by sending troops, and by February of 1862, a number of Union victories had forced Confederate forces to retreat from Kentucky. After the death of Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh, the Confederate government appointed General Braxton Bragg to head the armies in the West. Bragg devised a plan to revive the Confederate cause in the West, an invasion of Kentucky. Such a campaign, Bragg thought, would raise new troops from among the pro-Confederate citizens of Kentucky and might even bring the state into the Confederacy. Bragg entered Kentucky in August of 1862, but the campaign did not work as he had hoped. Although some Kentuckians rallied to the Confederate standard, even more volunteers enlisted in the Union cause to expel the invaders. After a number of encounters with the enemy over a period of several weeks, Bragg ordered a retreat into Tennessee. His great invasion had failed, and the Confederacy never again seriously threatened Kentucky. Chattanooga, climax in the West. Chickamauga, September 1863. In 1863, Union forces moved across Tennessee. In the summer, they steadily pushed back the outnumbered Confederates through Chattanooga and into northern Georgia. General William Rosecrans, the Union commander, pushed his men on for what he thought would be the final blow against General Bragg's army. Bragg counterattacked near the banks of a creek named Chickamauga, Cherokee for River of Death. In 2 days, September 19 and 20, the Confederates shattered the Union forces. Complete disaster for the Union was avoided only through the courage of General George Thomas. He calmly held his troops on the field to protect the retreating forces and then slowly withdrew. Despite the heroics of Thomas and his troops, the Battle of Chickamauga was a major Confederate victory for a disastrous Union defeat. The Union army was trapped in Chattanooga, and Bragg threatened to starve it just as Grant had starved Vicksburg. Union reorganization. Rosecrans' disastrous defeat forced the Lincoln administration to make changes. General George Thomas replaced Rosecrans as commander of the forces in Chattanooga. Meanwhile, Lincoln rewarded Grant by making him chief of all Union forces in the West. Grant and part of his troops left the Mississippi region for Chattanooga. First, Grant broke the siege that Bragg had laid and got supplies into the hungry city. Then he prepared to drive the Confederates from their strong positions south on the city on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. Fighting for Chattanooga, November 24th and 5th of 1863. As the Battle of Chattanooga began, Union soldiers captured Lookout Mountain on November 24th. The mist-and-shroud encounter became known as the Battle Above the Clouds. but the Southerners still held the more formidable position on Missionary Ridge. None of Grant's plans in the battle for the ridge November 25th worked as he had envisioned. When attacks on the Confederate line failed, Grant ordered General Thomas's men to create a diversion by capturing enemy trenches at the base of Missionary Ridge. The troops not only captured the trenches but also spontaneously swept beyond them, swarming up the ridge toward the main Confederate positions. Watching from a distance and unpleasantly surprised, General Grant asked Thomas, "Who ordered those men up the ridge?" "I don't know," replied General Thomas. "I did not." After watching for a few minutes, Grant muttered, "It's all right. If it turns out all right. If not, someone will suffer." The Union attack, however, surprised the outnumbered Southerners almost as much as it had Grant. Missionary Ridge was soon in Northern hands, and Bragg's troops were again retreating into Georgia. General Bragg had earned a reputation for angering easily, refusing to listen to suggestions, failing to act decisively. He now resigned his command, and President Davis replaced him with Joseph E. Johnston. 3 months later, President Lincoln promoted Grant to commander of all Union forces. Georgia was open to invasion, and the tide in the West was definitely flowing in the Union's favor. Number 4. On the home front. War consists of more than the dramatic clash of arms on the battlefield. In addition to the suffering of the wounded was the quieter but no less real suffering of those at home. Behind the lines of battle lay large civilian populations and their governments, all of which tried to function as effectively as possible in the strained circumstances of war. Life behind the lines in the South. Because most of the fighting took place on Southern soil, life in the South was far more difficult than life in the North. In addition, the Confederate leaders had to assemble a central government and thus confronted problems that the Lincoln administration never faced. The South, for example, possessed very little gold and silver. The Confederacy therefore found itself printing paper money with no support except confidence in their government. As people realized the worthlessness of the money and as Confederate success on the battlefield dwindled, prices soared. By late 1864, hams were selling in Richmond for as much as $350 apiece. And by the following January, flour was $425 a barrel. By the end of 1864, Confederate money was worth 1/40th of its face value. After the war, of course, it was worth nothing. Many who invested heavily in the Confederate cause lost everything they possessed. Some goods were extremely scarce, and both civilians and soldiers suffered from shortages of food and clothing. People learned to make do with what was available. Newspaper in Vicksburg printed their issue on wallpaper when supplies of newsprint ran out. A Memphis newspaper used shoe polish when it had no more ink. Sometimes the shortages resulted in anger and violence. In April of 1863, a hungry woman in Richmond started a riot because of a bread shortage. Mobs smashed windows, broke into stores, and stole food. Only when Jefferson Davis personally confronted the rioters and persuaded them to disperse did the violence stop. The primary cause of shortages was the Union blockade of the Confederacy. Some daring merchant ships called the blockade runners risked the wrath of the Union Navy to bring supplies into Southern ports, where those goods were sold for enormous profits. Many blockade runners, usually operating at night, were successful. Historians have noted that the Confederate effort was well organized and administered, and that the Southern defeat might have come much sooner without blockade running. Nonetheless, Southern trade dropped below pre-war levels. The primary reason for this drop was the fact that the British, with the mightiest navy in the world, chose to accept the blockade. Had Britain been determined to trade normally with the South, the North could not have stopped the British short of declaring war on them. As the war progressed, the Union built more ships and captured more Confederate seaports. As a result, the effectiveness of the blockade increased. The blockade running became too hazardous to be profitable. In the North, the situation on the northern home front was easier, but it was not without problems. Inflation and shortages also plagued Northern families, but neither became as severe as in the South. In fact, after the first shock of secession, the North actually entered a period of prosperity. With most farm workers away fighting, farmers learned to rely more heavily on machinery, such as the McCormick's reaper, to do the work. As a result, Northern farms produced more foodstuffs during the war than they had before. Likewise, heavy industries such as ironworking profited from the Union Army's need for cannons, iron for ships, and other war supplies. At the close of the war, an increasingly prosperous North stood in marked contrast to a devastated, war-torn South. Government in time of war. Filling the ranks. The main challenge for both the Union and the Confederacy was assembling an army. At first, volunteers were more than enough to fill the ranks. As the war dragged on, however, men became less willing to serve in the army as they saw the casualty list and realized how their families back home were suffering. Eventually, first the Confederacy and then the Union adopted conscription, the drafting or compulsory enrollment of men into military service. Unfortunately, the resulting draft laws were not always fair. Anyone drafted could avoid serving by hiring a substitute or paying an exemption fee. Such provisions led to mutterings that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Resistance to the draft arose in both sections. In the South, a surprising amount of the opposition came from state government officials. Having gone to war over the issue of states' rights, many officials resisted giving the central government the power to draft recruits. Especially troublesome were the governors of Georgia and North Carolina. Because the draft law exempted justices of the peace from the draft, for example, the governor of Georgia appointed hundreds of new justices to save them from conscription. In all, North Carolina and Georgia accounted for more than 90% of the exemptions granted in the Confederate draft. Although a few Southerners resisted the draft with violence, the North faced scenes of violent resistance. The most vicious example was the New York draft riot in July of 1863. The city of New York was home to many recent immigrants, many of whom did not understand the war, and few of whom wanted to fight in it. In 4 days of rioting, mobs attacked not only government officials, but also the first African American population. For example, one mob burned an orphanage for black children, and another seized a crippled black coach driver and hanged him from a lamppost. By the time the riots were suppressed, 119 people had died, and about 300 had been injured. But the New York riots were about more than the draft. Under the surface was racial animosity. Some New Yorkers, especially Irish and German immigrants, were becoming unwilling to risk death in battle for what they were coming to see as a war to free blacks. Many were worried that freed slaves would swell the number and competitors for their jobs. Black people provided a valuable pool of recruits for the work needed to conduct war. The South used some free black men in non-military roles such as wagon drivers and in the construction of fortifications. Some Confederate generals proposed using black men in combat roles. At the very end of the war, Robert E. Lee even suggested granting slaves their freedom in return for fighting for the Confederacy. But the idea came too late to be enacted. Most African Americans who saw combat fought in the Union Army, fighting for the freedom of their race. Blacks provided about 10% of the Union Army soldiers and about 1/4 of the Navy sailors. Their brave performance in battle did much to dispel the prejudice that black people were inferior to white people, and they proved important in the Union cause. Border states. Of interest to both the Union and the Confederacy were the border states. Slave states that did not secede from the Union: Mississippi, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Missouri, despite guerrilla warfare among its citizens, remained in the Union. Delaware never seriously considered seceding, and Kentucky, after an initial declaration of neutrality, joined the Union cause. Maryland was a special case. The loyalty of its citizens was about evenly divided, and no one knew for certain what the state would do. If Maryland seceded, however, Washington, D.C. would be left rather uncomfortably within the Confederacy. To avoid this risk, Lincoln ordered the military occupation of the state. The national government jailed pro-Confederacy leaders without trial and stationed troops in secessionist hotspot, such as Baltimore. Only in the middle of 1862, after the first crisis had passed, did Lincoln order the release of the political prisoners. Another border state owed its existence to the war. When Virginia seceded from the Union, citizens in the mountainous western portion of the state refused to follow. With the help of the Union Army and the federal government, Western Virginia established its own state government. Though the Constitution states that no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, within the consent of the legislatures of the states occurred, Article 4, Section 3, the federal government recognized the pro-Union state, and Congress admitted it to the Union on June 20th of 1863 as the state of West Virginia. Pro-Union East Tennesseans tried to form their own state too, but before they could do so, Confederate troops occupied the area and held it for the South. Lincoln and the Constitution. As the situation in Maryland and West Virginia indicate, the war led to strong disagreements regarding the federal government's actions. In fact, some of Lincoln's northern opponents complained that the president was making himself a dictator and ignoring the Constitution. Lincoln, for example, suspended writs of habeas corpus, meaning that the government could arrest a person without charging him with the crime or bringing him to trial. Thousands of such arrests were made, and Lincoln defended his actions by noting that the Constitution allowed suspending writs of habeas corpus in case of rebellion or invasion. Critics replied that such power belonged only to Congress, since Article 1 deals with the power of the legislative branch. Like all wartime leaders, Lincoln faced the challenges of balancing the desire to win the war with protection of citizens' rights. As the war progressed and the Union government felt more secure, some conflicts became less common. In March of 1863, to eliminate questions of constitutionality, Congress officially gave the president the power that he had been exercising. Copperheads. One reason for Lincoln's actions was his fear of Southern sympathizers in the North. Such men were called Copperheads, after the poisonous snake of that name. In the border states in the southern parts of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, Copperhead sentiment was strong. In reality, the Copperheads may not have been as numerous as the administration feared, and many of them were interested in securing peace rather than directly helping the Southern cause. Their presence, however, was a constant worry for the Lincoln administration. Diplomatic maneuvers. The war was fought largely within the borders of the United States, but its impact was international. The main goal of Southern diplomacy was to persuade a European power, preferably Great Britain, to accept the independence of the Confederacy, just as France had recognized the United States during the Revolutionary War. The North obviously sought to keep Europe as part of the affair. Southern efforts. Southerners hoped at first that simple economics would force Britain to recognize the Confederacy. The British textile industry depended heavily on the southern cotton to supply its mills. The South thought that when the British lost their source of cotton, they would come to the South's aid. Yet Great Britain was not eager to risk war with the United States over what seemed, to the British at least, a purely international American matter. The use of cotton from India and Egypt enabled the British to do without the South's cotton. The South came closest to receiving British help, but because of Union mistakes. In November of 1861, an incident on the sea nearly brought Britain into the war on the side of the Confederacy. The Confederate government had commissioned two agents, John Slidell and James Mason, to go to Europe for negotiation of aid. They were sailing on a British mail ship, the Trent, when the USS Navy forced the British ship to surrender the agents. The Trent affair, as it was called, outraged the British, who demanded an apology and release of Mason and Slidell. Secretary of State Seward freed the agents and managed to apologize in a way that satisfied the British, but did not offend the Northern public. The Union thus narrowly avoided British intervention. Ultimately, Britain would recognize the Confederacy only if it thought the South would actually win. This fact led many Southerners to hope that a great military victory would bring Britain to their side. Much as the Battle of Saratoga had persuaded France to help the United States during the War for Independence, thus one of the motives for Lee's Maryland campaign was to win a victory that would impress the British. The unclear result of the Battle of the Antietam, however, dashed those hopes, and despite numerous victories in the early years of the war, the South could never seem to gain the decisive victory it needed to win British recognition. Emancipation Proclamation. When the Civil War began, Lincoln indicated that the conflict was a war to preserve the Union, not a battle against slavery. As the fighting progressed and as casualties continued to increase, Lincoln concluded that he could end some slavery through his war powers. In September of 1862, shortly after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. As the January 1st, 1863, Lincoln declared all slaves in rebel-controlled territory would be freed. The proclamation therefore excluded slaves in the border states and Confederate territories under Union control, such as New Orleans. The President had four main purposes in issuing the proclamation. He wanted, 1, to keep Britain from recognizing the South by appealing to the strong British anti-slavery feeling. 2, to encourage black people to join the war effort and fight for the Union. To revive failing spirits of the North by giving Northerners another reason for fighting the war in addition to preserving the Union. And 4, to take the first step toward freeing slaves. Lincoln achieved his goals. Britain did not recognize the Confederacy. Thousands of black men joined the Union force, and although some Northerners initially resisted fighting to free the slaves, by the end of the war most were describing their fight as a battle for freedom. As noted, the proclamation did not apply to border slaves. Lincoln feared freeing slaves that might risk losing the loyalty of the border state governments. Thus, since the Confederacy did not recognize Lincoln as its leader, the decree technically did not free any slaves. However, later as the Union Army advanced, slaves in captured areas were freed. Also, Lincoln presented the Emancipation Proclamation as a wartime emergency act, like his suspension of habeas corpus. Otherwise, of course, the President had no power to make such a sweeping act without the consent of Congress. The President anticipated that, however, whatever happened, those who were later freed by Union soldiers were not likely to be re-enslaved. Regardless of its limitations, the Emancipation Proclamation was an important step toward eliminating slavery. By its existence, the proclamation transformed the conflict from a war to save the nation to a war of liberation. We shout for joy that we live to record these righteous decree, rejoiced Frederick Douglass. 5. The Road to Appomattox. War in the Wilderness. As mentioned earlier, Grant's success in the West resulted in Lincoln giving him command of all Union forces. When Grant assumed his new position in March of 1864, General Meade warned him that Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia was not the same as Bragg and the Army of Tennessee. In other words, Grant's new opponent Lee would provide a greater challenge than he had previously faced. Wilderness Campaign. With a force of 122,000 troops, Grant marched south toward Richmond. Lee, with half that number, blocked his advance near the scene of his Chancellorsville triumph a year earlier. In the dense woods and tangled underbrush appropriately called the Wilderness, the two armies began a month-long series of battles. The Wilderness Campaign resulted in some of the costliest, most desperate fighting of the war. In the battles of the Wilderness, May 5th and 6th of 1864, Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 8th through 12th, and the North Anna River, May 16th through the 23rd, the Confederates dealt punishing blows to the Union forces. Yet Grant kept up the pressure, unlike previous Union commanders, such as McClellan. Grant did not retreat after a major setback. At Spotsylvania, he wrote, "I propose to fight it out along this line if it takes all summer." Cold Harbor. At dusty crossroads called Cold Harbor, east of Richmond, Grant made his costliest mistake of the campaign. The battle there, in June 1 through 3, climaxed on the final day with a massive assault on the entrenched Confederate positions that left 7,000 Union soldiers dead or dying before the sun had fully risen. When the soldiers were ordered to renew the suicidal assault, they simply refused. Between the two armies lay acres of bodies, what soldiers from both sides dubbed Grant's slaughter pen. A survivor later described it as not war, but murder. Cold Harbor capped a month of devastation for the battered Union Army. In 4 weeks of nearly continuous fighting, Grant had lost more men than Lee had in an entire army. The difference, however, was that Grant could replace his numbers. Lee could not. Every assault on the thin Southern line made them thinner yet. In addition, while the Union supply lines had more than enough food and clothing, some Southern soldiers were literally starving. In late May, for example, many Confederates received a ration of only one biscuit, with perhaps a slice of bacon every 2 days. War in Georgia. When Grant was made commander of all the Union forces, he left the troops in Chattanooga under the command of his most trusted officer, General William Tecumseh Sherman. His task was to destroy General Joseph Johnston's Southern Army and to capture Atlanta, Georgia, one of the South's most important remaining railroad and manufacturing centers. Sherman approached the job with a grim determination. War is cruelty, he said, and you cannot refine it. Atlanta Campaign, May to September of 1864. In May 1864, Sherman began his campaign 100 miles from his goal. Between the Union forces and Atlanta stood a smaller, but resolute force under General Joseph E. Johnston. A master of defensive tactics, Johnston carefully constructed fortifications of earth, timber, and stone, and waited for his adversary to make a mistake. Sherman usually knew better than to attack such strong positions. Instead, he would use his superior numbers to slip around the Southerners, forcing them to retreat or be overwhelmed. Johnston's slow and skillful retreats frustrated Sherman, but they also irritated Jefferson Davis. The Confederate president thought that the Southern general was afraid to fight and was risking the loss of Atlanta. In July, when the Union armies forced Johnston back just north of Atlanta, Davis replaced him with the fiery, energetic John B. Hood. True to his reputation as a fighter, General Hood attacked the moment numerous Union forces in the Battle of Atlanta, July 20th through the 22nd, 1864. The attack surprised Sherman, but the Federals recovered quickly. The Southerners suffered heavy casualties. Slowed but not halted, Sherman continued to encircle the city, faced with destruction. If he stayed, Hood abandoned Atlanta on September 2nd. The March to the Sea, November to December, 1864. As Sherman sat in Atlanta, he devised an idea to hasten the end of the war. He would wage total war on the South, destroying not only its armies, but also its economy as well. He marched his army 300 miles across Georgia to Savannah on the coast. Along the way, he fought against soldiers and civilians alike. The march served two purposes. First, Sherman's men could destroy food, animals, and other supplies that supported the Confederate army. And second, the march would show Southerners that the Confederacy was rapidly losing the ability to resist. As Sherman himself said, if the North can march an army right through the South, it is proof positive that the North will prevail. As he prepared what became known as the March to the Sea, Sherman told his superiors in Washington, "I can make the march and make Georgia howl." Sherman began marching toward Savannah on November 15th. As he did so, he left a trail of destruction 50 to 60 miles wide from Atlanta to Savannah. Anything that could be used to support the Confederate war effort, crops, livestock, railroad lines, personal valuables, was either seized for the Union forces or destroyed. They burned houses, barns by the hundreds, and for decades to come the Georgia countryside was punctuated by lone, blackened chimneys, all that remained of once elegant homes, with only loose control by their officers. Some men became little more than vandals, wreaking, looting, and destroying. When Sherman reached Savannah in December, which he offered as a Christmas gift to Lincoln, the general estimated that his army had done $100 million worth of damage to Georgia. The March to the Sea was a deadly blow to the provisions and morale of the Confederate war effort, and it left deep emotional scars in the Southern people. Election of 1864. Sherman's success almost came too late for Abraham Lincoln. Grant's bloody battles with Lee in the north, Virginia, and Sherman's slow advance in northern Georgia were creating weariness with the war in the north. No end to the fighting seemed to be in sight, and by the summer of 1864, Lincoln's chances for re-election looked slim. On August 3rd, Lincoln wrote, "This morning, as far for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected." Facing Lincoln as the Democratic nominee was none other than George McClellan, former head of the Army of the Potomac. Although McClellan insisted that the Union must be preserved, most members of his party were seeking an end to the war almost at any price. The fall of Atlanta in September, however, changed the situation. Suddenly, victory looked probable, even certain. War fatigue melted in the warmth of military triumph. On Election Day, Lincoln won 55% of the votes and overwhelmed McClellan 212 to 21 in the Electoral College. The election of 1864 guaranteed that the effort to preserve the Union would continue. Interestingly, Lincoln captured 78% of the recorded soldiers' votes against his former general. Confederate collapse. Siege of Petersburg, July 1864 to March 1865. After Grant's Cold Harbor disaster, he continued to move southward, slipped across the James River, and laid a 25-mile-long siege line against Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg was the major railroad junction that led into Richmond from the south. If Petersburg fell to the overwhelming Union forces, Richmond would be separated from the remainder of the CSA. For 9 months, July 1864 to March 1865, the two armies eyed each other and tested each other's defenses. Battle, deaths, and diseases took their toll on both sides, but the drain was particularly noticeable in the Confederate ranks because no replacements were available. The torching of the fertile Shenandoah Valley by Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan and of East Tennessee by George Stoneman's cavalry compounded supply problems for Lee's army. Also, the situation in the Carolinas was quickly sealing the fate of the Confederates. From Savannah, Sherman marched his army north through the Carolinas, wreaking the same havoc there that he had in Georgia. As Union forces pushed north, they left destruction and bitterness in their wake. On April 1st, 1865, when the fall of Petersburg was nearing, Lee's only hope was to slip out of the siege and link with General Johnston in North Carolina. Johnston's soldiers were retreating from Sherman's advance. Davis and his cabinet abandoned Richmond for Danville in southern Virginia. The Confederate Army also made a desperate attempt to reach the rail lines, first at Danville, then at Lynchburg. At every turn, Grant's encircling army stopped them. Realizing the obstacles that he faced, Lee told his men that he was compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources, and was determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services had endeared them to their countrymen. Appomattox, April 1865. On Palm Sunday, April 9th, 1865, Lee met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where they agreed on the terms of surrender for the Army of the Northern Virginia. Grant, recalling the impression of their meeting, later wrote that he felt sad and depressed. "I felt anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of the foe who had fought so long and valiantly." Grant's generous terms, basically that the Confederates would lay down their weapons and go home, gave Lee the opportunity to surrender with honor. Lee appreciatively accepted Grant's offer. When word of Lee's surrender spread, the noise of celebration and gun salutes erupted throughout the Union lines, but Grant quickly ordered it to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Indeed, all for practical purposes, the war was over. Within days, Joseph Johnston surrendered his forces to William Sherman near Durham, North Carolina, and the remaining Confederate forces surrendered in May. Bitter harvest. The surrender closed the bloodiest chapter in American history. More Americans died during the Civil War than in all other wars combined from 1775 to 1975, from the Revolutionary War through Vietnam. Over 600,000 men died in the 4-year war. Tens of thousands were maimed for life. A national tragedy occurred 5 days after the surrender. On Good Friday, April 14th, an actor named John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Several hours later, President Lincoln died. Soldiers trapped Booth in a Virginia barn almost 2 weeks later, and the barn was burned, and Booth either took his own life or was killed by one of his pursuers. At his last cabinet meeting on the day he was assassinated, Lincoln had extended his hand to the fallen South. According to one cabinet member, the president had warned that there were men in Congress who possessed feelings of hate and vindictiveness, in which he did not sympathize and could not participate. In restoring the Confederate States to the Union, Lincoln called for no persecution, no bloody work. In Jefferson Davis's last address to his beleaguered citizens, in the final desperate days in April, he wrote, "Let us not then despond, my countrymen, but relying on the never-failing mercies and protecting care of our God, let us meet the foe with fresh defiance, with unconquered, unconquerable hearts." But as he wrote these words, much of the South lay in ruins. It was an impoverished land of widows, orphans, where many were nursing the wounds of war. Ahead of the country lay a long, difficult road to national healing.